Thank you very much. Good evening. It is really lovely to be with you. Always lovely to travel down the road to come and see our friends here. And I'm just so glad that you've given an evening to think together about this topic. We know the topic of transgender is so prominent in our culture around us. It's kind of hard to avoid, really, isn't it? We regularly hear stories of celebrities coming out as trans or as non-binary or as gender fluid. And we hear debates in the news, debates around athletics or sports competitions and transgender athletes, debates around hospital wards and where it's best to care for transgender patients, debates about public toilet usage and pronouns, those little words like he and she and which should be used. But also, we know that for many of us, this would also be a topic that is much closer to home, maybe even in our own homes or the homes of people we know and love. And that's particularly maybe the case in the way that this topic now is impacting younger generations among teenagers as well. In our nation, as with most Western nations, there's a huge number of young people identifying as trans or as non-binary or some related gender identity. And it may be that for some of us here today, as is mentioned, it's a very, very real-life issue. And so what we're talking tonight, it really isn't just about abstract stuff, it is real life. And I just therefore want to be sensitive and try and be sensitive in the way we engage with this tonight. And we just kind of encourage you, if it is real life for you, if you need to at the end, reach out, talk to one of the pastoral team here, talk to some close friends, process some of what's being said, because I know that this isn't just abstract, this is real life. But my hope is that what we're going to be able to do tonight is to gain to be equipped by gaining firstly a bit of understanding of what actually is happening, especially among teenagers in our nation when it comes to this topic. And then a bit of kind of practical wisdom of how can we best love and care for the young people in our lives in relation to this topic. That might be through parenting or through grandparenting. It might be as a youth leader. It might just be as a friend of people with children and having input into young people's lives in that way. And we're going to break it into two halves with a discussion break in the middle, as we've heard. First half, we're going to talk about understanding, trying to get our heads around what is transgender, what is happening among young people, and how might we kind of understand and kind of evaluate that. That's, in a sense, the theory bit. It is kind of quite complex in some places, so I'm going to try and make it as digestible as possible, but we need to understand well before we can think about responding. And then our second half will be, well, how do we actually respond? That's when we get to some nice practical stuff. How do we help young people to live in our culture where this is such a prominent thing among young people? And how do we walk alongside and love those who maybe are themselves questioning their gender identity or who are identifying as trans? What might it look like to do that? And this is a hugely complex topic, and I do not at all claim to have all the answers. I don't think anyone does or anyone can really. I certainly can't claim to have any expertise in parenting, but what I have been doing is for years I've been researching this topic, engaging with it, working with other people. I work in various contexts with parents and doctors and pediatricians and psychologists who are kind of working in this whole field. And so my hope is tonight you will benefit from some of the little nuggets of wisdom and understanding that I've gained over those years of exploring this topic. So let's start off with understanding transgender, getting our heads in the right place to afterwards think about how we respond. First off, just what is actually transgender? What are we even talking about when we use that word? One of the complexities of this topic is that that word is used in a very broad, kind of catch-all way. But at its base, it basically is talking about this. This is how Stonewall, one of the big LGBT charities in our nation, defines the word transgender. They say it's an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as or does not sit comfortably with the sex they were assigned at birth. You might notice in that definition there are two prior concepts we've got to get our heads around. Firstly, there's gender, which in this context means someone's kind of personal internal sense of who they are as a man or a woman, or as neither, or as somewhere in between. It's kind of how someone feels themselves to be inside. Sometimes it's called gender identity or experienced gender. It's how we're experiencing their experience of gender. But then also in there was sex assigned at birth, or sometimes just known as sex or biological sex. That's our identification as male or female based on our physical anatomy. Basically, it's what our bodies say, what our chromosomes, our hormones, our gonads, and our genitals say about whether we are male or whether we're female. And for the vast majority of people, those two things kind of line up. Most biological males feel like men, most biological females feel like women, and we call that cisgender. But for some people, there can be a very real and genuine kind of disconnect or a tension or conflict between those two things. So their body might seem to say one thing, but actually inside they feel themselves to be in some way different to what their body might seem to say. And transgender is this broad umbrella term to describe lots of different experiences of that disconnect and lots of different understandings of that disconnect. And it's important just to recognize that under that very broad term, there is a huge range of diversity. As I said, different experiences, different understandings. There's a helpful phrase from a Christian psychologist called Mark Yarhouse who says, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. Which he means there's so much diversity of experience, we can't assume that because we know of one experience, we understand another experience. It's helpful to be aware of the great complexity of what we're talking about. Another term we should just define as we start is the term gender dysphoria. You might have heard that in this conversation as well. Gender dysphoria is the medical diagnosis that can be given when someone experiences considerable distress because of transgender experience. So if there is that disconnect or tension between what the body seems to say in biological sex and how someone experiences themselves to being experienced gender identity, if that causes distress, that can be diagnosed as gender dysphoria. And so the diagnosis is particularly about the distress. The distress is deemed to be the problem. And that's an experience which can happen in childhood, it can happen in adolescence, it can continue into adulthood, and we'll talk about kind of various forms of that experience as we go through the evening. And then finally, we might just want to touch on what we might call emerging gender identities. There are an increasing number of different terms being used to describe an increasing number of different experiences, all of which kind of fall under that broader category of transgender. All of them are in some way about the interplay between what your body says in biological sex and how you feel yourself to be internally in gender identity. And so there's different variations, things like non-binary identities, where someone doesn't feel they're a man or a woman. They don't fit with the kind of either or, the binary of gender. Or bigender, where someone feels they are simultaneously both a man and a woman, so therefore they have two genders. There are various fluid identities, or the sense of actually gender for someone isn't a static thing, but at different times they feel themselves to be differently gendered or agender. Just a sense actually of not really experiencing or identifying with any gender. And some of those experiences will be accompanied by or will include clinically diagnosable gender dysphoria, but some won't. And so not all young people who identify in one of these ways will be experiencing gender dysphoria as a psychologist might define it or might diagnose it, but some of them will. And really these are the identities which are becoming increasingly common among young people. And there's an increasing variety of experiences and understandings of that coming about. And so that's just a little bit of understanding of kind of what are some of these terms, what are some of these concepts we're talking about, which allows us to think about what is the current situation among young people, especially teenagers we're thinking about here. Though also this would impact younger children as well. In the last decade, trans has become a huge reality among young people. Just over 10 years ago, I was finishing college, and I don't think I knew of anyone in college who was trans. I don't think I really knew very much, if anything at all, about the concept of being trans. Come back a decade, 10 years later, I can pretty much guarantee that any young person you know will know someone, quite possibly multiple people, who in some way is identifying as trans or is questioning their gender identity. It has become, even that short space of time, such a huge and common phenomenon. And there are various ways we're seeing the reality and the evidence of that. One place we see this huge increase is in the referrals being made to the NHS Gender Identity Development Service, the one main NHS provider for under 18s when it comes to gender. In the decade between 2009 and 2019, they saw a huge increase in their referrals, a 1,469% increase for biological males, and a 5,337% increase for girls. In 2010, they had only about 130 referrals. In 2020, they had 2,748. If you look at the graph, the line is very, very steep. And actually, in the last couple of years, it's begun to kind of level out. Last year was lower, last financial year was lower by a few hundred, but COVID might well really have had an impact in that. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of young people being referred to the NHS Gender Identity Clinic, we're also seeing an increasing number of young adults, particularly kind of early 20s, mid-20s, who are detransitioning. That means that at some point in their teen and later teen years, they transitioned to live in line of how they felt themselves to be inside and their gender identity, rather than with their biological sex. Believing that that's what they needed to do, believing that would be good for them, it would solve a load of problems they felt they were facing. Very sadly, a few years down the line, many of them have found actually that hasn't really solved the problems they thought it would. It hasn't delivered on the promise it made to them, and they're choosing to revert to live in line with their biological sex rather than their experienced gender identity. Some of them are claiming that actually medical professionals pushed them too quickly into transition and didn't help them explore what they were really experiencing, explore other ways of handling that. And there are no official records of detransitioners. People often say regret is very low, but the reality is when you want to detransition, you don't go back to the people who pushed you to do this stuff. There are no official records. We don't know how many people are in this very sad situation. But anecdotally, it is very evident that increasing numbers, more and more stories are coming out, mainly of biological females who now are reverting again to live as women. And all of this, what is happening? What we see happening in these referral rates, in the numbers of detransitioners coming out, just in what you no doubt will be aware of from the young people you know, is rightly and helpfully, I think, raising some really big questions. Questions like, why is there this huge increase in the number of young people questioning their gender, identifying as trans, being referred to GIDS? One of the interesting questions is, why has there been a switch? Because it used to be, before 10 years ago, that it was primarily biological males, young boys, who were referred to the NHS Gender Identity Development Service. Now, by far, it's majority biological females. Why has that switch taken place? That's an important question. Why is it we're finding so many young adults who are detransitioning after not many years of having transitioned to live in line with their gender identity? And one of the key questions is, are the current standard treatments and standard responses to young people saying they identify as trans or experiencing gender dysphoria, are they the right treatments? Are they the right ways to respond? And this at the moment is a huge area of debate in the medical world and also in the kind of wider culture. You might be aware of all manner of questions being asked at the moment about GIDS and Tavistock. There's a number of legal cases going on in our nation. Interestingly, the UK really is the place this conversation is playing out. We are the ones having the legal cases. We are the ones doing all this stuff. What's really interesting is other nations are changing their practices because of our legal cases and our things, and we as of yet are not particularly. It's interesting. Other nations are looking on us at the test case and realizing maybe this hasn't been right. And so we are right in the midst and really right at a key point where brave people are standing up, questioning things, challenging things, exploring these questions. So that's this situation, both kind of on a national scale, but I expect it would resonate with many of you if you know anything about what's going on in schools and among young people you might know. So the real question becomes, how do we understand this situation? That's what's happening. No one can kind of really question. Those figures are there. This is happening in our nation. The same is represented across most developed Western nations. Why is that? Why this huge increase? How do we answer some of those questions? And really, there are two ways of answering that question, and two very different ways, two very different perspectives people take. And it's helpful to get these in our head as kind of a framework for some of the ways we see people engaging with this conversation. One perspective is what we might call the diversity perspective. This would be representative of kind of some of the LGBT charities and certainly many of the big trans charities. It would be representative of a lot of the stuff on the internet, although not all of it, but certainly some of the things our young people might well encounter on the internet. I think often it is really what's being presented in schools. And certainly some of the campaign groups try and get this view very strongly into schools. And it is certainly the dominant view among most young people. Most young people will gravitate towards this diversity perspective. And the diversity perspective is built on something else that we might call gender identity theory. What gender identity theory says is that sense you have inside of being a man or a woman really is who you are. It says that each one of us has this innate, we're born with it, this core sense of being a man or a woman, and that is determinative for who we actually are, for our true identity. And it says that to find our best life, to thrive and flourish in life, we need to embrace what we find inside, and we need to live that out. And it basically says that everything and anything else that disagrees is wrong and needs to change. The body, the community, tradition, anything outside of us needs to change to come into line with who we really are inside, who our gender identity says we are. And therefore, the diversity perspective leads to what we might kind of call a very pro-transitioning approach, as in it's very quick to say, yes, a young person should transition to live in line of how they feel themselves to be, rather than with what their body says. And so on this perspective, the diversity perspective, the huge increase we've seen in the number of young people identifying as trans, being referred to GIDS, is just about more visibility. On this perspective, this is really who people are. How you feel really is who you are. And this huge increase in numbers we're seeing is just because we're in the first time in human history where it's kind of safe and possible for people to really be honest about what they're feeling, to express that and to come out and to live in that way. In a sense, they would say there's not much new happening, it's just that we're seeing it for the first time. That's the diversity perspective on one side. And then on the other side, there's what I've dubbed, although I don't like the term, actually, I need to find a better term, but I dub it the disability perspective. This would be representative of an increasing number of critical clinicians and medical professionals, of some organizations you might have heard of, like Transgender Trend, which is a parent-led organization. Interestingly, it's also the view of quite a number of older transgender people who are much later in life, who have transitioned, many who have been transitioned and lived as a trans person for many years, but who look on what's going on among young people and actually take this kind of perspective. On this perspective, gender dysphoria, or that sense of the internal self not lining up with biological sex and what the body says, is not deemed to reveal true self or true identity, but is an example of kind of disability or confusion or suffering or just a general sense of disease. It's hard to kind of quite put a term on it, but it's a sense of actually just something that isn't quite right and needs to be addressed and helped to try and bring some peace to the young person's life. And so this can often be influenced, it seems, by many different factors. And people on the disability perspective would say the best way to help a young person who's questioning their gender identity, who's identifying as trans, is just to gently explore various things in life and in their experience which might be feeding into and influencing that situation, to see if actually we can help them find a level of peace with their bodies, and particularly to see if we can avoid very invasive and ultimately life-altering medical procedures. In this perspective, the disability perspective, sometimes people talk of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or adolescent onset gender dysphoria, which you may have heard about. It's a very kind of controversial term. What this is observing is one of the new phenomena in the last 10, 15 years is that whereas it always used to be that gender dysphoria kind of hit young children, and for those who it persisted into adolescence, what we're now finding is lots of teenagers who seemingly very suddenly, kind of out of the blue, begin to identify as transgender. Having never expressed anything like that as a child, sometimes never really having exhibited any level of gender nonconformity, as in not fitting in with the kind of stereotypes we put on gender experience, but suddenly identifying in this way. It rapidly appears, hence rapid onset. And that's proved a hugely controversial theory and idea, but is gaining increasing support among a lot of clinicians working in this area. And what this perspective observes is if you look at the stories of detransitioners, those who choose to live back in line with their biological sex, and if you look at the referrals to GIDS, the young people identifying as trans, you can actually often see a whole load of kind of common repeating factors. Things like mental health. Referrals to GIDS, young people there have much higher than average in the general average teenage population occurrence of pre-existing mental health diagnoses. Many of them have already had a mental health diagnosis of anxiety or depression or of OCD. Autism may be a factor. If you look at the referrals to GIDS, there's a disproportionate proportion, or the number of them, who have a diagnosis of autism or ASD than in the wider population. Why is that? Internalized homophobia seems to be a thing. Many of the young women who are detransitioning, are living again as women in their early or mid-20s, are recognizing that actually they're attracted to other women and that their uncomfortableness with that and various things about that were actually why they wanted to be a trans man attracted to women rather than a woman attracted to women. Same-sex sexuality seems to potentially have a part to play. Gender stereotypes has a part to play. If we have very narrow boxes of what it means to be a man or a woman, if a young person feels they don't fit into one box, but they more feel inclined to another box, maybe actually that is where they should be, they think. Trauma also. There's, again, disproportionately, it's the case that young people referred to kids have been through various forms of traumatic experiences, and that might have a part to play. And the final one is social influence, and we'll come back to this, but there does seem to be evidence that trans has become almost a contagious idea. And it seems to go around friendship groups very quickly. So one of the things about rapid onset gender dysphoria is not just someone suddenly out of the blue really identifying as trans, but actually within a friendship group, multiple, usually young women, at around the same time, all identifying in the same way. We should just kind of, prick up our ears and think what actually is going on. And so the disability perspective says the best way we can help young people in this situation is to explore all these manner of different kind of factors that may contribute to this experience. See if we can help them to find peace, find resolution with their body through looking at some of those things, which avoids invasive, life-altering medical interventions, and also avoids the problem that many of these detransitioners are reporting that actually transitioning didn't really solve their problems. It might have masked it briefly, but there were more fundamental things going on. This view also helpfully notes that for the vast, vast majority of young people who experience gender dysphoria, if they are allowed to go through puberty naturally, to continue growing up naturally, that feeling will naturally abate. It will naturally go away. Figures vary in different studies, but it kind of tends to be between kind of the mid-60s and mid-80s% of young people who will find that naturally goes away if they're able to go through puberty naturally. So again, this view kind of says it's better to allow puberty to take its course. Many will find a sense of peace and resolution in that. And on the disability perspective, the huge increase that we're seeing actually is explained by the fact that trans has become kind of the culturally available and the popular among teenagers explanation for and kind of way of dealing with the general disease that many of us feel as teenagers. If you think back to your teenage years, most of us bit relate, they're not easy times. Most teenagers, for all manner of understandable reasons, feel a sense of dis-ease, of not being quite comfortable in their own skin, all manner of kind of stresses and pressures that make us feel not quite right. Trans, it seems, might have become the available explanation that young people hear and can grab onto to try and give some sense of meaning and explanation to what they're experiencing and a promise of release from it if they transition, say. So those are two, you can hear, very radically different perspectives. One which is going to say this is who people are, we need to help them, affirm them in their internal gender, help them to transition. And one which says this seems to be far more complicated. There could be many different things affecting someone, and isn't it better to try and help them find peace with their body and avoid invasive interventions and address what might be kind of deeper things going on? What we, of course, then want to ask is, well, as followers of Jesus, what are we to make of all of this? What is a Christian understanding of this? How do we navigate this as Christians, as followers of Jesus? Well, I think that actually a biblical view on this comes actually to align with what I would see as good evidence and good science in supporting more of the disability perspective that we have talked about. In the diversity perspective, which is the most vocal in our culture, we're told that the things we feel inside are who we really are. In youth culture, that view is kind of massively loud being shouted in their ears. You hear it about trans, you hear it about sexuality. Who you are inside is actually who you are. You hear it in the coming out stories of celebrities. Still, one of the most famous transgender celebrities is Caitlyn Jenner, who was a gold medal winning Olympic athlete, came out as trans back in 2015, and in an interview that year said this. They said, "I had a lot of conversations and kind of came to a revelation that maybe I should be honest with myself about who I am." Notice the identity language, who I am, and let that person, this woman who's lived inside me for my entire life, finally have an opportunity to live. Notice Jenner talks about identity. It's who I am, and it's internal. There's this woman who's been trapped inside of me all my life, and now, finally, she's getting her chance to live. We're told this is all about identity. Or just last year, the actor Elliot Page came out as trans and said, "I can't begin to express how remarkable it feels to finally love who I am, identity, enough to pursue my authentic self." And this is the kind of narrative that all the time our young people are being told. What you feel inside is who you really are. So the theory goes that's who you are, and therefore you need to embrace that and express that. Everyone else needs to embrace that for you so you can find your best life, you can thrive and flourish in life. I.e., if you feel inside that you are different to what your body says, you need to be able to transition to live in line with how you feel inside. This is an example of what we might call internal identity formation. It answers the question, how do I find who I am? By saying, you decide, and you do that by looking inside yourself, and you kind of basically tell the rest of us. Nothing outside matters. All that matters is what you feel inside. It's what our culture says for trans, it says it for sexuality as well. But the question we want to do, ask as Christians, is to take a step back and ask, well, is that actually true? Are we who we find inside? And is that the best way of answering the question, how do I find who I am? And I think if we stop and pause and ask that question, we find it really isn't the best way of answering that question, and really it doesn't really work. One of the problems of basing your identity on what you feel inside is that it's really unclear. What if you've got competing desires or competing feelings? You really feel this about yourself and you really feel this, but actually they can't both be true. Which one do you choose? It's really unclear. Another one is that it's unsupported. If you've got those two competing feelings and you pick one, well, where's the authority to say that is the one you should pick, not the other one? In reality, if your body and your internal sense of self conflict, where's the authority to say you should go with what you feel inside rather than with going with your body? What this view actually does is it puts huge pressure on us. And you see this in young people, the huge pressure they feel. I've got to work out who I am. Only I can tell you who I am. I've got to find out. And actually, it's a crushing pressure for a young person to have to carry. But really, the kind of clincher here, the thing that really shows this just doesn't work, is none of us really believe it. No one really believes that who you are inside is who you really are, and you should embrace that and express that. That's because we all recognize that there are some feelings we might experience or some desires we might have inside that we would not say, that is who you are, and you should embrace that and express that. There are people who identify as trans-abled. They are able-bodied in their physical body, and yet they feel themselves internally to be disabled. And some even seek help to change their physical bodies to make them disabled to line up with how they feel themselves to be inside. Almost none of us would go, yes, how you feel inside is who you are. Or there are people who identify as trans species. They are of the human species by birth and by biology, and yet they feel themselves inside to be of a different species. And again, some seek to make cosmetic changes to their body so that their body more closely aligns to how they feel themselves to be inside. Almost none of us at that point go, yes, you do you, that's who you are, it's the best thing for you. The reality is pretty much no one believes across the board that what you find inside is who you are. We're really inconsistent in this. And if we wouldn't apply it to some things, why do we apply it to gender when the body seems to say something different? Internal identity is in many ways a rubbish and really unhelpful way of finding who we are. We need a different answer to the question, how do I find who I am? Some people think, well, inside doesn't work, so I'll go outside. I'll let other people decide what I think. Let's see how people evaluate me. What do people think of me? But that's not great. That can really backfire. If there's a lot of pressure on us, we've got to keep performing, keep impressing people, keep living up to their criteria so they think well of us. It's just a really bad way of living your life. In reality, the only stable, solid, truly life-giving basis for identity is God, is our creator. How do I find who I am? God decides, which if God made us kind of makes total sense. I think people can see the logic of that. If God made us, it makes sense that he would tell us who we truly are. And when it comes to this particular topic, we can open the very first chapter of the Bible and see that we're told that we're created by God, male and female. That is a good thing. That is a gift of God. That is a given identity handed to us, as it were, by God. And it's given to us and expressed to us in our bodies. You see that in science. The only way in science of determining male and female is in the structuring of an organism towards reproduction. Ultimately, if you whittle it right down, it comes down to the gametes. That means the sex cells. Females have large gametes, males have small gametes. That's across the species, it's across the board, how biologists will define male and female. It's the only truly binary, the either-or bit we can use to determine that. And I think the Bible points in the same direction. Genesis 1:27 says God made us male and female. The very next thing the Bible tells us in Genesis 1:28 is go and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Male and female immediately flows into the commission to be fruitful, because what does it mean to be male or female? It means to have a body that is structured towards reproduction by uniting with one who is different from you. Our identity as male or female is given to us by God in our bodies. And that's a really good thing, because that means it's solid and it's stable and it doesn't change. It means it has an authority supporting it, because God says that's who we are, and we can be consistent because we can always affirm what God says of us. And I think this is why transitioning in a Christian understanding is, as I've wrestled with Scripture, I've come to the conclusion transitioning is not the best nor the right response to an experience of gender dysphoria or to trans experience. And that makes sense when we realize who we are is given to us by God, including as male or female, given to us in our body. And so I think for Christians trying to wrestle with this really difficult topic and the reality, which is a reality of gender dysphoria that some people experience, actually we have to shift our understanding. So trans experience and gender dysphoria are not about identity and knowing who we really are, but they are a very real experience of suffering, of difficulty that we can face in our embodied nature in living in this world. It's just one of the many ways that all of us will experience suffering in different ways in our bodies, in our life. And that shift in perspective, this is an experience of suffering rather than an indication of identity, helps us to begin to think about a response. Because the question then becomes, are there ways within the bounds of what God tells us and what God allows for us that we can reduce that suffering? Which is why I think the disability perspective of exploring underlying factors that might be contributing to the distress a young person is experiencing is a good thing. This is an experience of suffering, and part of compassion and care there is thinking, are there ways we can help to relieve that? And then the question, if we can't totally reduce suffering, if suffering can't always be ended, which across the board we know often there's suffering we can't change and can't solve completely, we can then ask the question, how has God equipped us to handle suffering and to help other people to handle suffering? Which we as Christians actually are uniquely equipped to handle suffering well, to help other people to do the same. We have something, I think, unique to bring into this conversation. And so I think getting a biblical understanding of our identity as men or women helps us to better frame the experiences young people are having, to ask them better questions about how we help them. That is only a very brief, quick overview of what might be a Christian reflection or Christian response to transgender, which in a sense is a whole other topic and talk on its own. If you want to Google my name and transgender, you'll find loads of that kind of stuff online. Or also, I recently published this little booklet, People Not Pronouns, Reflections on Transgender Experience, where I go into much detail actually of what does it look like to reflect Christianly and respond Christianly to trans experience, focusing more really on adults living with gender dysphoria, but gives some of that framework which hopefully might be helpful. And so I hope all of this, and I know it's a lot to take in, and well done if you're still with me, gives us a level of understanding from which we can then begin to think about how might we practically respond. But let's pause before we do that. Why not take a few minutes for discussion in your little groups, just discuss things like what's been helpful so far, what questions has it left you with, because we should have plenty of time for questions a little bit later. And if you feel comfortable to, why not share what's been your own experience of this topic, even kind of what brought you here tonight, and has what we've talked about shaped or helped and spoken into your own experience. Let's take 5 minutes, say, to discuss some of that, and then we'll come to some of the practical response. Hope that gave your brains a bit of breathing space and just helpful to process with some other people. That first half gives us some level of understanding of the general terms, the whole topic we're talking about, also of the situation we're experiencing, we're observing among young people, and how we most Christians might begin to think about that. And now we're going to think about some really kind of practical on the ground stuff of responding in two halves. In a moment, we'll come to thinking, how might we actually walk with a young person who is themselves questioning their gender identity or identifying as trans? But first, I want to do some more kind of preparatory stuff, preparing I've called it. We're answering the question, how do we prepare children and young people to navigate their experience of gender in our cultural context? Because this is so much linked to the culture and the world our young people are living in. How do we help them? How do we look out for them and care for them in that context? I think there are 4 things I thought it's helpful to highlight here. The first one will be unsurprising to you, given what we've already said. The first one is about identity. We said that in the diversity perspective, identity is central to this whole thing. Young people all the time are being told what you feel inside is who you really are. You need to embrace that no matter what anyone else says. So I think one of the most important things, and I really believe for the generation coming up, one of the most important things for us to engage with them on is the topic of identity. And helping young people to realize that actually the true source of our identity is what God says, and that is good news. That is a good thing. That's the best basis for identity. So I think one way we help young people is affirming identity as received from God. That means it's not discovered within ourselves. It also means it's not based on what other people think of us and they kind of project on us. It's revealed in what God says to us. I think, this is all age dependent. That is something that's good to explicitly talk to our young people about, to have discussions about who we are, who other people are, about identity. Talking about the messages of popular culture. Look out for where popular culture is sending that message of who I am inside is who I really am, and just take those opportunities to discuss that. Does that work? Is that actually good news? I think one of the good ways to do this is to talk about the identity of other people in the sense of to talk about the fact that we're all made in the image of God. When other people are speaking badly of someone, or when there's a news story, an ethical debate going on actually, which is about the dignity and the right to life of people, us affirming that all people are made in the image of God as a given identity. The identity is given to us by God is a great way, totally unrelated to this topic, just to be helping our young people to realize who we really are is rooted in what God says about us. I think we also, though, get to demonstrate this in how we relate to young people. It's an interesting question to ask. Do our young people think that we value them and love them based on what they do, or based on their achievements, or based on what they do or don't feel inside? Or do they think we relate to them based on who God says they are, how God has made them? And that's one of the ways that we subtly help young people to understand identity, understand who they are. And as well as affirming identity is given by God, I think also we want to affirm the goodness and the givenness of the body. Because in the diversity perspective, as actually in much of our culture, there's a really low view of the body. In the diversity perspective, the body is just this kind of casing, this outer shell in which the real you, your true self dwells, and the body can be changed and molded to come into line with who you really are, which is all part of a wider kind of downplaying of and seeing as insignificant of the body in our wider culture. Actually, we know that the body is a good gift given by God to us. Not without its problems, because all our bodies are impacted by the results of sin in the world and by the brokenness in the world. But it's a good part of God's creation, and it's key to who we are. We don't have a body, we are a body. Our body is a key part of who we actually are. And actually affirming that is important. I think one of the ways we can do this is actually just by affirming the value of the physical world that God has created. We live in a culture that downplays the value of the physical, and our young people especially live often a very non-physical existence. Let's be honest, they live lots of life in a virtual existence in the cloud. And actually, it's engaging in physical things, sport, physical activity, eating to help fit its dense, arts, being outside. It's just a way of gently affirming all this physical stuff God has made is good. And it's for our thriving and for our flourishing. One of the things you often see parents of trans-identified teens talk about is that they withdraw from kind of all their other hobbies and interests and they go into this online world. They go into a disembodied world almost. Actually keeping our young people rooted in the goodness of the physical creation is a gentle way we kind of feed into this. And I think healthy conversations about the body. Again, there's different types of helpful conversations we can have at different ages, but discussing the messages that TV and film and media and songs, social media and songs send to us about our body so we can see the goodness of the body as a gift of God to us. So identity and thinking about how we help young people to think rightly and healthily about that is a good way of preparing. Another really key one that kind of overlaps in some ways is about stereotypes. We need to be really careful about gender stereotypes and about how we handle them well and really how we keep them in their place. In many ways, trans and the kind of affirmative perspective of trans depends on stereotypes. In reality, if who you are as a gendered being isn't determined by your body, there's not much else left to define who you are apart from gender stereotypes. If you ask the question, what does it mean to feel like a woman who's actually got a male body? Pretty much the only thing it can mean to feel like a woman, if it's not about your body, is that you line up to gender stereotypes, how people think women often are. In our culture, interestingly, trans, despite the fact it claims to be the great kind of throwing off of the shackles of oppression of tradition and historic morality and all sorts, actually solidifying very old-fashioned gender stereotypes. And again, you hear the narrative of trans teens. What do you mean you feel like you're a girl, but you've got a boy's body? Well, actually, I like the girls' toys. Or I like, what's my head the other day? It's often stereotypes that come in. I don't fit in the boy box, therefore I must be a girl. Because what else is there to define it, in a sense? Now, stereotypes are complex. Many of them have an element of truth. In reality, many stereotypes describe the statistical majority. And they're helpful ways that our brains categorize things and get used to new ideas. They can be helpful. But we need to remember stereotypes are generalizations. They're not universals. And stereotypes are observations. They're not guidelines. The problems come when we don't keep stereotypes in their right place and we forget those key things about them. Problems emerge when we imply that what is generally true must be universally true. Or when we say that stereotypes are not just how things often are, but actually how things need to always be. Because when we do that, stereotypes can begin to aggravate, maybe sometimes even actually cause gender dysphoria, or at least questioning about gender identity, especially among young people. And when you hear the stories of much younger people, younger children who identify as trans, often there does seem to be a very strong influence of gender stereotypes, partly because until the age of 8, they're still trying to work out actually what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and still think that if you change your clothes, you actually have changed your sex. It's kind of between the ages of 6 and 8 that a child actually gets the idea that sex is a static thing, and if a man puts on a dress, he's still a man. Before that age, a child really believes that man is now a woman because he's wearing a dress. Stereotypes can have a huge influence on younger people, but I think actually on lots of people, they can have stereotypes. If we have very narrow ideas of what a boy or a girl, a man or a woman is, people think, I don't fit. Maybe that's not me. And I think we, at this point, have to put our hands up so that we as Christians and churches have often been guilty of propagating and using stereotypes in unhelpful ways, implying their guidelines of how things should be, their universals, not generalizations. And actually, we need to recognize that and correct that. And the way we do that is by combining it with a biblical view of identity and of who we are as men and women. You see, in reality, we are men and women as an identity given to us by God in our bodies. Being a man or woman isn't something you have to earn by performing something, or have to earn or create by acting in a certain way, or you have to stay in the man or woman box to be a man or woman. You're a man or woman because God says you are. That's how he's created you, what he says to you in your body. And that gives us actually a wonderful freedom. That gives us the freedom to be how we are without changing who we are. When we know we're a man or a woman because God says we are, our personalities and our preferences, they don't really matter whether they fit in the traditional female box or the traditional male box. It doesn't change who we really are. This has been really significant for me. So in my childhood, I experienced a mild level of discomfort in my gender identity. There was a period in my childhood when I believed I was a girl internally, even though everyone seemed to think I was a boy, and my body said I was a boy. As I grew up, that naturally went away, as it does for most people, but I lived for years, until recent years, with, to be honest, a lingering sense of not really being a real man, not really making the cut. I hated all male environments. I didn't think I was a girl, but I kind of wanted to be one of the girls. I would say things like, oh, he would say that he's a man. Me and the girls were over here, the men are over there. And then I gradually came to realize, no, I'm a man because God says I'm a man. And that means that all the things about my likes and dislikes and my personality, which might be deemed quite traditionally feminine, which I used to think made me not really a real man, they don't matter. Because I know who I am, I'm a man because God says I'm a man, I can be how I am. That means I can embrace my love of musicals and of Downton Abbey and of afternoon tea and pretty things, and it doesn't change the fact I'm a man. It doesn't matter that I don't like rugby or beer or steak. I'm a man because God says I'm a man. This is wonderfully freeing. We have good news on the topic of who we are as men or as women. And I reckon that loads of people, young and old actually, I've discovered as I've traveled around and talked about this, will be hugely helped by this. I think we can help our young people by avoiding making stereotypes the thing that defines whether we're a man or woman. Not making these general things into universals, not making descriptions into prescriptions of how things must be. How do we tackle stereotypes? I think it can start for each one of us in being confident in how we are. In reality, almost no one matches up to all gender stereotypes, and actually being confident just in how we are, because we know who we are, sets an example in that. One of the most lovely comments I've had in the last few years from a guy in our church was when he thanked me for showing his 2 teenage sons a different way of being a man. I get to set an example of actually it's okay to be how I naturally am, doesn't change who I am. We can just be confident in how we are, set example there. But also it's just simple things like watching our words. Often it's in things like jokes or throwaway comments that these things actually come out. We just want to be really aware of them and think about the messages we might be sending in them. After stereotypes, I think a really important thing in preparing, helping our young people is to think about the internet. If you listen to the stories of trans-identifying teens, the internet almost always plays a part. The very common narrative is as a young person who says they had some general sense of dis-ease, like we talked about, most teenagers, a sense of something not quite being right, not quite knowing what it was. Then they stumbled upon trans on YouTube. They found the trans vloggers. They listened to hours and hours of that, and they suddenly realized, that's me. All this kind of undefined confusion and uncertainty I felt, that's what it is, that's me, I'm trans, and this must be the answer. That is a narrative you find time and time again. The influence of YouTube, the influence of social media. And of course, the problem with the internet is it creates echo chambers. There is a huge diversity of opinions on the internet, but the internet isn't very good at helping you see the diversity. It's good at helping you get trapped in a corner and hearing just lots of the same thing. And so I don't think it's that we want, especially of our teenagers, to hide them from lots of different ideas, but it's that the internet isn't very good at helping them find different ideas. And also that young people are not very well equipped to evaluate and assess different ideas. The reality is our brains are not fully formed about our mid-20s, and that thing of kind of evaluating, assessing, looking through different opinions is one of the things we struggle to do in our teenage years, partly because our brain's still developing, partly because everything else going on in our body makes it hard for our brain to think in those ways. And so we want to be aware that we're shaped by what we take in, particularly when we're younger. And I do think that means that actually it's wise for parents to be very involved in their young person's and their teenagers' internet usage. This is kind of obviously part of the whole wider thing of internet safety. But internet safety isn't just who can contact your child or young person through the internet. Internet safety isn't just about pornography, though both those things are very important to engage with. Internet safety is also about what is my young person, what ideas is my young person being exposed to? And are they getting a range of ideas? Are they equipped to evaluate that and understand that? How is that actually shaping them? How can we be responsible about that? Well, I think just thinking about, if you're a parent, what access do your young people have to the internet? What access at what age, in what ways, where, to what extent are you aware of what they're looking at, so that you can then have conversations. And as early as possible, starting those conversations so it's really natural and normal to be openly talking about things they're engaging with on the internet. And this might be a good point to make the point that there will probably be times when our children and our young people don't like us for the way we influence or even restrict their access to the internet. And as one of my pediatrician friends likes to always remind us, that is normal. The reality is there will always be times when, as a parent, your kids don't like the choices you're making, but the role of a parent is to do what's best for the child, even when they don't understand that. And the reason parents are giving is because children are not in a position to understand that, and parents much more are. Now, of course, we want to have secure relationships of love with our children, so even if they don't understand why we're doing something, hopefully they have a level of trust in us. But it is just a reality that we can't always be liked for everything we do. Sometimes we have to make the difficult choices, and this is an example of that. And there are several in this trans conversation where, as I say, particularly my pediatrician friends make the point actually of just good common sense parenting, even when our kids don't like that, is what is needed. And then the final one in preparing, which is very much a related point, is the point of community. This is another common theme in stories of trans-identifying teens. General sense of dis-ease, find the narrative online, and also find the community online. And there is a whole huge teenage trans-identifying teen community online. Message boards, all manner of things, and social media. And young people talk about it as being a place where they can finally belong. They can finally be honest about themselves, be themselves. They can be understood. They often talk about it as a place they can finally ask all the big questions they've got they've never felt able to ask before. What's, of course, really sad is that these people have felt the need, these young people have felt the need to go off to this little corner of the internet to find that. We need to make sure that we are building better, more life-giving, more welcoming, more helpful communities for our young people. In-person experiences of community, where they can have those kind of close friendships, where they can feel that they belong. They feel they can be honest about what's going on in their life. We want to try and develop relationships with them as parents, as pastors, as youth leaders, where they feel and they know they can ask anything. We want to be the safe place where they can ask any question, so they don't have to go off to some corner of the internet to ask it. How do we do this? I think a good challenge for us as adults is actually for us, again, to show this in example, put this into practice ourselves. The reality is we live in a culture, including a church culture, where friendship is hugely devalued. And many of us as adults do not have close, meaningful friendships, do not have a real experience of community in day-by-day life. Our children are never going to believe that embodied friendships are important if we don't actually demonstrate that in our own lives. I think one thing actually is to put it into practice ourselves. Also, I think speaking highly of friendship. It's very easy to speak highly of marriage. It's very easy to have the desire for our young people to reach what we see as the pinnacle of relational success by getting married. But firstly, we should question whether marriage is the pinnacle of relational success. I think there's biblical reasons to say it's not. And also, it's just not a helpful message to send. What about before that? Actually affirming friendship as vitally important, as deeply significant, as meaningful, as beneficial, as vital to flourishing, which I think is a very biblical viewpoint, is really important. So we're not contributing to what the world is already saying, which is you're only going to be relationally fulfilled when you've got a partner, and frankly, when you're having sex, the world would say. But actually we're showing, no, meaningful friendships are where it's at and are good things for us. And we want to be, as I said, the people who young people feel they can be really open and honest with. We want to have that openness, that confidence, that I think one of the ways to do that is just to show we're up for those conversations. This is going to depend on your context, the age of your young people and all sorts, but actually showing that we have questions too, showing that we have stuff going on in life, showing that it's safe to talk about big, difficult things that maybe we don't have the answers to yet. We're just kind of creating contexts and cultures where young people might hopefully feel this is a safe place for me to ask my questions, to engage with these things. So those are just a few practical pointers, things that I think help us to prepare our young people to navigate life in the context we're in. And you will know better than I, actually, in your own context, your own interactions with young people, as a parent, as a teacher, youth leader, whatever, how those might put into practice. But those four, I think, are really key. And then finally, let's just briefly talk about walking. What might it look like to walk with a young person who is identifying as trans, who maybe is experiencing gender dysphoria or just questioning their gender identity? Not an easy question to answer, but let me share with you just a few quick bits of wisdom that I've gleaned from various places over the years. The first thing, how should we walk with a child or young person situation, is hopefully obvious, is to walk in love. We want that to be our absolute first priority, that throughout the whole of the journey, our young person knows that they are loved by us, loved by God. That means things like thanking them for sharing with you when they share with you about their experience of gender or the questions they're asking. It would have been a scary thing for them to do, and as much as you might have so many questions in that moment, you might feel very panicked, the priority is just to make the young person think, I'm loved, and so this is a safe place. If in the first conversation, all you really get to is them walking away knowing they're loved, that's kind of okay, really, because we want to maintain that relationship so they feel it's a safe place for them to be and for them to engage. We want to keep affirming and showing that no matter how they feel, no matter what choices they make, no matter how they identify, we love them and we're a safe place for them to talk and to engage. From loving comes listening. Listening is very much a way of expressing our love often. We want to listen as a key way of loving them. We also want to listen just to understand more of what's going on. Remember I had that little phrase earlier from Mark Your House, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. Experiences here are so diverse that actually listening will be key to understanding what does my young person even mean when they're saying this to me? What actually is going on? What's the broader kind of picture here? And that sometimes will highlight things that we've talked about, some of these underlying factors. And it's not that we're trying to be a psychologist and to diagnose, but actually just getting a feel for different things that are going on, actually. There could be all manner of factors at play, different things, and this could be an inroad and opening with your child, opening up to you to actually explore how things are going in their life. I think open-ended questions are helpful. Things like, are these feelings relatively new or are they long felt? Things like, what do you mean? What does it feel like to you to feel like a girl rather than a boy? Exploring things there about stereotypes. Talking about, or just considering from what you know of your child or young person, whether mental health is a factor at play. Are there sexuality issues? Very often, a young person will come out, especially biological females, we see this, will come out as bisexual, and then later will come out as trans, actually. Is there actually a sexuality dimension to what's going on? And I say, it's not that we're trying to diagnose as such, we're just trying to get a broad understanding of the situation. The situation comes to us as it's this gender thing. Chances are there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in life that we can learn about as we listen. This one I've mentioned in passing. The next one, use common sense. One of my pediatrician friends often says, everyone, parents, clinicians, all of us kind of switched off our common sense when it comes to gender and trans because we feel so intimidated by the topic. But her encouragement is, you as parents are far more equipped to deal with this than you think you are. A lot of what is needed is just good, common sense parenting, which you will already be very well equipped to do. And don't kind of feel so bamboozled by it that you think, I can't do anything. Just think, as you normally would, engage in good, common sense parenting. And perhaps related to that is perspective. Helping your young person, well, I think for yourself actually, keeping in perspective, but also helping your young person to keep this in perspective. In a sense, avoiding gender questions becoming the most important thing or the only thing featuring in their life. It's not to say that they don't matter. It's affecting the young person. It might well be causing distress and difficulty. You want to take it seriously. You want to engage with them, want to love them in it and help them in it. But what you very often see happening with trans-identifying teens is it becomes the thing. They withdraw from other friendships. They withdraw from other hobbies, other things. They withdraw, as I mentioned, into that online trans world. Gender becomes the only important thing in life. And a really simple pushback against that is just to encourage them to think more broadly. Don't just talk to a young person about gender if that becomes a thing. Keep talking about other things. Strongly encourage them to keep involved with other friendships, with other activities that they do, because all of this is just a gentle pushback against the idea that trans is who I am and it's the most important thing about me. These kind of subtle ways we can help our young people. Next up, I said engage with God. Obvious, hopefully. You want to do that as an individual, as a family, crying out to God, praying for yourself in it, praying for wisdom, praying for strength as you walk a difficult path, praying for your young person in all that they are facing. But also, if your young person is up for it, depending on how old they are, where they are at with God, engaging with God together. And my encouragement here, I guess, kind of really thinking from my experience of my own journey, of my sexuality and stuff, is come not making pronouncements, but come ready to explore with someone. Young people, as we all do, need the freedom to question. They need the freedom to doubt. They need the freedom to explore and to reach their own conclusions. And doing that really leads us so often to a deeper, more strong, more strengthened faith than if we're told what to believe and kind of beaten over the head with that. That can be really difficult to do as a parent or as a youth leader, a pastor, because we've kind of got in that to trust that we trust that God's going to hold this young person while we let them journey, while we let them ask the questions. We want just to get them to the answers we think are right. Actually takes a real faith in God to allow them to go on that journey, but really that is the best way for them. And my encouragement where it's possible is to explore together. So rather than coming in with, well, God says this, so we're going to do this, actually, let's explore together. Let's read the Bible together. Let's pray together. Let's both read this book and then discuss it and learn together about it. Coming and journeying together. And I think exploring the bigger questions, again, as we've said a few times tonight, it so often becomes narrowed right down to the question of gender. Actually, bigger questions like, well, who does God say I am? What does God say to us when life is difficult or distressing? How can Jesus help me in what I'm facing? I think some of those bigger questions might be helpful. And then I think this is the last one, although really the most complex thing maybe we'll talk about all night. My advice, and again would be echoed by medical professional friends of mine, would be to avoid transition. This is by far the most complex question. For some of you, it might be the million-dollar question. You're thinking, I wonder how he's going to handle this one. What do we do if a young person, maybe our own children, wants to transition? It's very tricky, but I think there are very good reasons to say avoiding transition is the best thing. And here's just a few thoughts, a few things, reflections on this. Why do I say transition is best avoided for a teenager? Well, there's some really practical or kind of common sense stuff. We know that for the vast majority of young people who experience gender dysphoria, that will naturally go away if they're allowed to go through natural adolescence through puberty. For the vast majority, that means they can avoid all the difficulty and distress of major interventions, both social, psychological, and medical. We also know that medical transition, and even social transition, so changing name, pronouns, clothes and stuff, even that makes it less likely that a child, a young person will naturally find this goes away. Even social transition reduces the chance of this naturally alleviating and them coming out the other side, as it were, of this distress. When it comes to medical transition, that's things like puberty blockers, hormones, top surgery, maybe among teenagers. The reality is we just don't know what's safe. We don't know the long-term impacts of these kinds of treatment. We don't know if they're reversible. With puberty blockers, we don't know if they're reversible. We don't know if you have puberty later in life from synthetic hormones, it does the same thing to your body. There are big concerns about bone density, especially about brain development. Just think how much is going on in the body in puberty. It does sound like an unwise thing to pause it unnaturally. When it comes to cross-sex hormones, there are certainly impacts there on fertility and quite likely increased susceptibility to various different diseases and illnesses later in life as well. We just don't know in reality. This is an experiment, sadly, we're performing on young people. We don't know what the result will be in 10, 20, 30 years' time for teenagers who have paused puberty and they have started taking cross-sex hormones. With social transition, as I've noted, even changing names, pronouns, clothes and such like can actually stop the natural desistance or gender dysphoria that will often happen. And there is actually no evidence of true positive lasting impact of social transition. The activists will very loudly say it. If you look into the people who've looked through the various studies that are available, and they're all, generally speaking, fairly low quality studies, there's just no evidence that it's actually a good thing to do. Does this mean then going against the wishes of a teenager, will they not hate us for that? Well, in reality, yes, it does. And in reality, yes, perhaps they might. And I don't want to say that lightly, but also it's a thing my pediatrician my friend says of sometimes our role as adults caring for young people is to make the decisions that are good for them, even when they struggle with that, when that's painful for them. It is kind of a short-term painful, long-term gain kind of thing. Obviously, in an ideal world situation, you want to seek to have such a relationship with our children that actually they can accept that even when we do things they don't understand or don't agree with, they know we're doing it out of love. I know that sometimes a blue sky thinking in teenage years are not that straightforward and that simple. But I wonder if also a helpful thing can be, if your young person's opening it, to, again, journey together on it, to discuss it. Actually, there's so much good evidence that this stuff is not proved to be safe and quite likely isn't safe, then actually your child doesn't need to agree with what the Bible says. It doesn't need to be a faith-based thing if they're not interested in faith. It can be a simple, let's sit down and look at the research together. Let's sit down and look at some of the stories of some of the detransitioners together and think, what's a wise decision to make in this situation we're facing? One recommended resource here for any parent who is navigating life with a trans-identifying teen would be Bayswater Support Group. They're a secular group, but who run really helpful support groups, normally peer support, others going through the kind of same situation, who have, I think, very level-headed view on this and understanding of the risks and different things of transitioning, and some good support available there. A couple of other just final questions you might be thinking here. You might ask at this point, what about the risk of suicide? There's a very common slogan you may have heard battered about: it's better to have a living son than a dead daughter. In the sense of it's better to let your daughter transition and live as a boy than it is actually to lead her to take her own life. Very sadly, in this conversation, suicide has been weaponized. That's something that should never happen, because that is trivializing the awful and complex reality of suicide. Experts like the Samaritans tell us there's almost never one single cause behind suicide, and they tell us actually we shouldn't really even kind of seek to guess and hypothesize about the causes of suicide. That's not helpful and not really a wise way to move forward. The reality is lots of activist groups make claims about suicide risk to trans-identified teens that just aren't backed up by any reliable studies. The studies that are there are highly unreliable, tiny sample sizes, no control groups. They just don't really give us any firm answers. Tavistock, the NHS General Identity Clinic, their website claims or makes the statement that there is no greater suicide risk among their cohort of patients than is seen among CAMS, that's the child and adolescent mental health patients in general. Because what we do know, across the board, population in general, is mental health problems do increase risk of suicidality. And so that's why we want to take seriously mental health among our young people. It's not true that trans experience, trans identification in and of itself is a suicide risk, or that not affirming a child in social transition is a suicide risk. There just doesn't seem to be any firm evidence for that. So really my encouragement would be, don't be controlled by the fear that the activists seek to create that actually is not based on any helpful evidence. Again, just a quick shout out to a resource there, Transgender Trend have a really helpful article going through some of the studies on this, what research is available, and making that point of there just isn't evidence that there is an increased risk, but we want to care and love for our young people, especially in the face of mental health. And then finally, what about accessing medical services? Because in a sense, a logical next step for a family or a young person is identifying as trans is to access the medical services. And this is so complex because within medical services in the UK, there is a diversity of views, although actually, probably a majority would hold a diversity perspective. There are many raising concerns challenging the fact that even the NHS seems to be shaped more by trans activists than it does actually by the science and by the research that's available. There are some challenging that. There are important medical cases, there are very brave professionals speaking up against that, and that's a good thing we should be championing because that's about exploring this and safeguarding young people. And I guess basically my kind of overall advice is to be very careful engaging in medical services and to always be expressing the importance of taking that bigger view of what's going on in life in general, not just the trans element. So my medical friends tell me that many GPs will be very helpful if you kind of clearly express your views to them. And if you clearly express you want to explore the broad things that are going on in life, not just make it about a kind of gender thing itself. Beyond that, things get a bit more difficult. With GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service, waiting lists are so long, frankly, you probably won't get there. And I think waiting lists may even be closed because they're so long. So GIDS is almost irrelevant. You're more likely to refer to CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. Again, the wisdom from my medical professional friends, including some who work in the same, whatever the NHS group is called, that we're in, is that a lot of CAMS is on the diversity perspective and is very quick to push teenagers into transitioning. The very thing that high court cases at the moment are exploring is, are young people pushed too quickly into these decisions? And so their wisdom basically is just to be very cautious and alert when working with CAMS. And again, to be really clear on you want the whole range of what's going on in life and various things that might be involved here explored, not just for this to be treated singularly as a gender-related thing. Hopefully, things are changing in terms of medical services in our nation. As I say, brave people challenging important court cases and different things, but we are maybe a little bit away yet from a lasting change. But there is hope, I think, that we're reaching a tipping point where we're going to get to a place where we better serve and safeguard children in this. So, well done, if you're still with me. We've covered lots of stuff on a really complex topic, lots of info, and even then are only really scratching the surface. But my hope is that we've got a level of understanding of what's going on and some practical wisdom to be equipped to begin to go away. On your handout, you see there's some recommended resources there if you want to explore kind of various more bits of this. Why don't we pause again, turn to the people next to you, discuss again what's been helpful, what's confused you, discuss particularly what questions you now want to ask, and then Adzia and I will come back up and we'll spend a bit of time exploring some of those questions together.
I just want to say thank you for sharing tonight. The question I have is, a while back I came across a lot of studies that most males in the UK prisons come from broken homes or lack father figures and that kind of stuff. And having worked in schools, I saw a lot of behavior problems is likewise, through a breakdown in the family unit and that kind of stuff. But I don't want to stereotype, the trans kind of scene or anything. But is that the case with young people who are interested in transitioning? Are they likewise, percentage-wise, from broken homes, or always seeing this as more of a cultural and society thing? I'm just curious to know, statistics-wise, if you've got any information on that.
Yeah, I haven't got figures, but yeah, I think in general, yes, because one of the facts I mentioned was trauma, and so a broken or a kind of a divorcing parents or various family background complexities would be within that category, basically. So yeah, so I don't have any specific figures, but one of the things that would be deemed a traumatic and unsettling childhood experience would be kind of things that have happened at home or family breakdown or stuff. So certainly it seems to be potentially one of things. And again, if some of what's going on is this general sense of disease and distress within teenage years, that is aggravated by such difficult, complex home situations or whatever, and it makes sense that if this is the narrative available to young people to explain that and to deal with that, that could be a contributing factor. So I think within that whole mixable manner of different things that may feed in, yes, those kind of experiences are there as well.
I was just interested, you're saying, obviously we're focusing on teenagers and kids, and you're saying if you leave it to adulthood, the vast majority come out of that. What if they don't? What if at 20, 25, they're still saying that they believe they're in the wrong body for their gender?
That's why I read this booklet. It's about adults. And when I say, it depends who you're asking. I mean, in terms of safeguarding people, I think a healthy place for us to get to as a nation in terms of medical services, or well, I would say not the healthiest, but a healthy place is actually that it's not until early 20s, even mid-20s, that we allow people to make life-altering, invasive alterations to their body, because I say it's not till 25 that your brain gets to that point. And so when you listen to some secular people questioning what's going on, and parents of even secular parents of trans-identifying teens, they kind of say basically, if they get to 25 and they still feel the same, they still want to make these changes to their body, they will allow them at very least, if not kind of support them in that, because they feel at that point they're at a developmental stage to make that decision. I think there are still questions then: is that the best way of handling that? There's very little good quality research into the effects of transition for adults. The only long-term study we have, a 30-year study in Sweden, shows the results aren't particularly good. And even in the trans community, there's talk of a 10-year itch. That the first 10 years can be pretty good. And so the first few years, there's a real sense of euphoria after surgical transition and stuff. But actually, there's talk in the trans community about a 10-year itch that actually you come to a point of realizing it hasn't quite done what you thought it would. And we're in an interesting phase now where a number of post-transition people many years in kind of write things saying, I now look back and not always say I completely regret it, but I'm not sure if I would do it if I was back there again, because it was so invasive, so difficult, so life-altering. And some of them say, might there have been better ways of dealing with my distress? And my personal view, both from the science and also from scripture, would be the better way is to help people realize, even if it's continuing, this is an experience of suffering, so how do we navigate that? Because actually transitioning, I think morally isn't right, but also doesn't seem to do the job. And there are some people who say, actually, psychotherapy should also be much more at play in treatment for adults with gender dysphoria as well. So in some ways, my answer wouldn't change hugely, but I think just if you're a safeguarding thing, we should have a different position for young people because they're not in a position to make their own decisions in a way an adult is.
So, from a Christian perspective, I don't have an answer to this, I'm just wondering what your opinion is. Do you think there are genuine cases of people whose brain chemistry is the opposing to their body genders? Mm-hmm. And therefore, as a Christian, do we believe that exists? Is that a real thing, or is it all caused by other psychological issues along the way?
Right, yeah. So that's a view called brain sex theory. The idea that where our sex brains, there's a male brain and a female brain, and what might often be happening in the case of trans experience is someone's got, say, a male brain in a female body. I don't think that works just scientifically. There are differences that are statistically common in brains between men and women. So you get kind of bell curves on the charts. Most male brains are more like this, most female brains are more like this, but it very much is a statistically common and with variation thing. It's not an either-or thing. So it remains the fact that biological sex, how our bodies are orientated to reproduction, is the only binary, the only either-or part of our bodies. You can't scan a brain and say that is a male brain, there's a female brain. You might say that has many features which are more commonly found in otherwise female bodies, and it may be that some of that could play into trans experience of gender dysphoria, although I don't think I've seen studies that prove that. But we can't classify people based on brain. The studies that have been done tend to be done after people have had hormone treatment. And we now know that our brains change a lot in life. And so actually, if you've had cross-sex hormones for 10, 15, 20 years, and then when you die, they cut up your brain, is what this study does, it might not be surprising if your brain is more feminized if you've been taking estrogen for the past 20 years if you're biologically male. So we just don't know really much about it, but we do know there's not a binary and/or to determine based on brains.
I guess my question is kind of how you think we should be engaging with the wider world. Like, I think I've heard obviously, I know a few people and stuff like that, but in terms of like the wider topic, when we read stuff online, and as Christians, what should the church be? Should we just be keeping it at a personal level? And if you walk with a trans person, that's great, and we'll walk with a trans person. Or should we be have it? Do you know what I mean? The whole political arena. How do we get involved or keep well away? What's your kind of...
Yeah,
how do
I'm
we
struggling to
tackle
hear, but I think I got mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. My view, and I think it's the right question to ask. What we shouldn't do is storming, thinking we've got all the answers. We're going to tell people how it's at. That's step one. So the question becomes: should we engage? And then how do we engage? So should we engage? I think on this aspect of the conversation particularly, yes, absolutely. There are very real safeguarding concerns here. We will look back in decades to come, not many decades, and be horrified at what we did as a society. I have no doubt about that. And because we are called as Christians to speak up for the vulnerable, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, to work for the protection of people, I absolutely think that Christians should engage in this. Who should engage and how we engage is a different question. So I don't think having a soapbox in the street, posting lots of stuff on our social media is particularly helpful. I do think there are specific ways we can do it. I think it's great that medical professionals are doing things. I think it's great when we're getting involved in policy, different kind of things like that. More broadly, it's kind of difficult. It depends whether we think it's a harm thing. So more broadly, should we try and change what's going on? In a sense, no, because we're not in the art of behavior modification. We're in the art, as it were, or the business of identity changing through which behavior modification comes. So I'm not particularly interested in how a trans person lives their life. I'm more interested in whether they love and follow Jesus, and then it's going to really matter how they live their life. It's then really difficult. It's very debated whether transitioning is or isn't good news for adults and is or isn't harmful. And so I think it's harder to say, is there an obligation on us as Christians to engage? Even if I concluded there was, I'd still be asking the same question actually of who are the right people to do that and what are the ways. And that's true of lots of issues, actually, that social media ranting and such that isn't the way to do it, but actually influencing policy, influencing professional boards in different ways is the way to do it.
Hi, that was really helpful this evening. So in our schools, it's all about diversity. That is, it's constant. It's on trend. It's what our kids are getting in school. As a teacher, I am teaching children who have changed their names, and are going through this. But I see them for, an hour or 2 hours a week. It's minimal. Have you got any advice for how to the line and how to navigate between my Christian faith and my beliefs and how I would treat these children to how schools are promoting diversity and how, as a Christian in a school, I can navigate that in a respectful but godly manner?
Yeah. It's hugely complex, isn't it? I will say a few things, but I'm not at all an expert, I confess. So I think one of the things I encourage people to think about doing is a lot of what is being taught in schools and how schools are handling this is because schools are targeted by LGBT charities and given very specific ways of doing things, their training and stuff. And a lot of schools don't know there are other viewpoints on it. And so even just, I don't know how that works, with the relevant people, raising the conversations of have we explored a variety of resources to help us navigate helping these students for PSHE lessons and stuff like that. And so looking at stuff produced by people like Transgender Trend, as well as the inevitable Stonewall and guides the teachers will be looking at, because from teachers I've spoken to, often that just isn't known. There's the very vocal groups and other things aren't just known about. So I think, encouraging schools and whoever's responsible in schools for doing that stuff to look at a diversity of stuff. And I think we can do that again because there is genuine risk of and evidence of harm here. We can come from that basis. So it isn't that we're the Bible bashers, it's that we're people who really care about people. And in our culture, for secular people, harm is pretty much the only thing that matters when it comes to anything much. It's about morality. And so actually, we make it from a harm position. Actually, I'm reading this stuff and thinking about this stuff, and I'm just concerned that is this the best way to help a student? So you're aware these guys produce this material, which is quite different. Should we look at this? The wonderful thing would be that gets a nice receptive response to explore that. So really, I think approaching it at that level probably is the best, because I imagine as teachers, in a sense, you're obliged to follow what the policies the school has. So I think working with the policy makers is a good starting point. And I would just point you to Transgender Trend. They have, stuff for schools and for teachers. They may well even have things, what do I do if I'm a teacher in a school with a very different perspective? They might have that, actually, which might be helpful to look at.
I've just got a question. You might not have the answer. So my son has just started secondary school, and he's, to me, he's very young. Sort of all this is very new to him. And one of his teachers is a female. Well, I shouldn't say that. So they're not allowed to call her Miss or Mrs. They have to call her Mix. And he's really confused by it all. So I'm trying to, from a Christian point of view, explain. And I always use this verse that you quoted in here. God made us male, female, and But have you got any advice? Because it does bug him, So and on a few occasions he's, I think not just him, but some of him and his friends, they forget and they say Miss, and she very quickly corrects them. And I think now that they're sort of 3-4 weeks in, I think she gets getting a bit annoyed, if they forget and they say Miss instead of Mix. And she makes, or this person makes comments like, they're not allowed to say she or he, they have to say they gave me homework. So just, I don't know if you've got any kind of advice in terms of what I can give him, Because I don't want him to start questioning, you know what I mean.
I think it's so difficult. I think we, as much as we might not want our, I can't remember how old you said, sorry, 11-year-olds, the start of secondary school age to be having to wrestle with these questions, it is unavoidable in our culture. Before that, probably actually, as Christians, we very easily want to shelter our young people from things, and the risk is we try and shelter them for too long, which means someone else gets the first word. Same with sex. No, you want to be the first people to talk to your kids about sex, which means you've got to do it pretty early. This one particularly, I think it's giving young people the framework to understand or the Christian framework to understand what's happening. So basically, it's the Bible's big story. And I think one of the most important things for us to teach children of any age is the Bible's big story. So it starts with the verse at the beginning of we're made in a certain way. God makes a good creation, made men and female, because the story doesn't stop there. We also know Genesis 3, the world goes wrong. All of us in different ways experience the fact that the world is not as it should be, not as God originally created it. All of us in our minds, our bodies, the world around us experience kind of that brokenness, some of that difficulty. And so we're always going to encounter people who actually believe different things from us, who feel differently from us, who maybe actually don't believe what God says is good and is right for them. And then teaching children that God's story helps us understand that that's the case. But then Jesus' example helps us see that even the people who really disagree with us or really seem to do stuff that God doesn't want them to do, Jesus loved them and ate with them and became friends with them and stuff, and he never judged them. The example of Jesus is really helpful. And then talking about actually the good news of the gospel and how that comes into this. So I think just the simple structure of the Bible story, the thing of there's a way the world's meant to be, but all of us experience the world not like that. So actually we're no different from your son's teacher in that way. And then we've got the example of Jesus of how we treat people. I think that, particularly the Genesis 3 thing, begins to get over the complexity of, or the confusion thing. It doesn't solve the confusion thing, it makes it a bit easier. I'd point you to one of the resources on the list, which is called something like Gender, a Conversation Guide for Parents, which kind of does that in, I think, 3 different age groups. So kind of probably pre-primary, primary, and secondary-ish, of how might we talk about gender in the context of the Bible's big story at different ages, which would be quite helpful, I think, to the kind of thing you're talking about. But that'd be my starting point, at least, of trying to help a young person to process that. And also, as we said, just being the person they can ask. So it's great that you know this, assuming your child has told you this, and being really unshockable, being really happy to talk really open about these things, just shows them safe place to come and talk about this is really healthy. So it's great that he's done that, and that's a great first step.
Andrew, I just want to say a massive thank you as well, because I think just on behalf of us as a church and a Christian community, the fact that you're just devoting yourself to thinking this through, talking about it with love and compassion and wisdom and not just surface skimming over the edge is just a massive, massive thank you to you and for doing that. A question I guess we didn't talk a lot about non-binary tonight, but I just wonder do you think that that's going to be an evolving space because it doesn't involve gender realignment, it doesn't involve having to make gender decisions around stereotypes, and actually it seems very, you can see culturally popular to express a non-binary position. And just like a little touch on that, I don't know if you see it, or I know that's a biggie,
Yeah, I mean, I think non-binary identities are becoming more common. It's why I put it under the kind of emerging gender identities. In a sense, we primarily started with trans. Now we're seeing many, many more. And I think there's various reasons why it's going to become more common. One is part of what our culture's whole view in gender has tried to do is to get rid of the idea of binary. And there's this huge tension, actually, in culture of trans, in its kind of formal, traditional sense, relies very strongly on a binary. There is a clear disconnect to my body and my internal self, and they're completely opposite things. So in a sense, trans affirms the binary, and yet at the same time, people have been trying to throw away the concept of binary, and we've moved forward in that, so I think therefore people are going to experience that more. I think also because it's coming with stronger and stronger of what you feel inside is who you are, I think that's going to actually result in more non-binary identities in the sense of, as I mentioned in passing, none of us match up to all the gender stereotypes. And so the more and more a young person is told how you feel inside is who you are, the more likely, in a sense, they are to notice, I'm experiencing various different things. So this bit of me seems really masculine, this bit seems really feminine. So there seems to be really an inevitable consequence of that that narrative, really, and that process. And also there's the fact that there's this funny thing that young people are constantly told they need to be their own individual self, because the individuality is a huge thing among young people, even though, confusingly, individuality is usually expressed through following the crowd or the latest trendy thing. But actually, I do, frankly, think one of the reasons we're seeing a proliferation of various different gender identities, in the same way we're seeing a proliferation of sexual identities, is because young people are told they need to be individual. So if my experience internally is fractionally different from yours, I need a different term. And so we're going to see more non-binary, but actually we're going to see much more of what we don't even know yet, in a sense, actually many more expressions of gender, I think, because of that. It's all just the natural outworking of the rather unhelpful and messy culture young people are living in, I think.
Yeah, and I think I think from it just so much of what you said this evening as well, of this understanding that we're very much about pain avoidance in culture, and that we don't want anything that causes us pain or suffering. Yeah. And actually there is so much about the gospel that leads us to a place where sometimes you recognize this involves a cost and a suffering that I accept that, and that's a hard thing to say sometimes, but I think that the Christian gospel, as you just said a second ago, teaches us that there's a better way here. There is good news for us, regardless of the suffering we may well experience if we are experiencing gender dysphoria or things like that. And again, is there anything you just say on that? Because I've just heard you speak on it before, and I think you articulate it so well, just an understanding of suffering or a theology of suffering in these things.
Yeah, you've kind of said it. I mean, if you take God out of the mix, and so you take eternity out of the mix, all that matters in life is having a good time now. And so, and because in large part, not completely, as we've recently seen, as humanity in the West, we've got rid of the great evils that have plagued humanity of war, famine, and plague, although we haven't quite done the plague one. Once those are gone, what's next? It's making life as good as it can be and as long as it can be, which is why the next big thing is transhumanism. How long can I make my life last? Can I live as a brain and a computer and stuff for future? And so, we hugely live in a culture where the goal of life is to reduce pain and to extend life and have as much fun and happiness as we can, which is just, in all manner of ways, really unrealistic and unhelpful. And I think, so in terms of parenting, just helping young people realize, against the Bible story thing, we live in a good creation, broken, all of us are going to experience suffering. And that literally is part of life, and that is inevitable. And we sometimes forget that because we are so privileged with the modern technologies we have. And many of us don't experience any levels of extreme suffering in a way which 100 years ago, everyone would have done from day dot and would have seen around them all the time. So I think it's really helpful for all of us just to realize we are not God, and therefore we do experience frailty, brokenness. We can't avoid all of that. But then to show actually, and this is one way we as Christians can bring something good to the culture. Culture is trying to extend life. They can't do that very well. And trying to make life without pain. They can't do that either. We can offer eternal life, and we can actually offer real resources that really help you to navigate life with pain. So as usual, in the mess of the culture, there's a huge opportunity for the gospel. And so books like Andrew and Rachel's Life Never Expected is so helpful, even I think as an evangelistic thing. If we have a better way of dealing with the reality of life you're facing, And, it's not the kind of science, how can you believe in God questions that are the big ones these days. Suffering still is the big one, and sexuality and gender. And so suffering pairs nicely with this. Yeah, they're the big areas we need to engage with if we want to engage with our culture.
Excellent. Andrew, thank you so much for serving us. You have blessed us so much. I was wondering, before we kind of finish, could you pray for us as parents, as youth leaders, as kids workers, as grandparents? Like, please pray for us for wisdom and how we handle all of this.
Yeah. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your goodness to us in your creation of us, in your giving us identities, in your giving us your word to guide us and lead us in life. And Lord, as we come before you tonight and we've thought about these complex issues, we do just ask for your wisdom. We ask for your help. We pray for everyone for whom this is a real life thing. Maybe even right now in our minds are young people we know and love, who we know this is impacting. And we ask, would you give us all the grace, all the wisdom, all the understanding to be able to love well and to be able to care well. And we do pray, Lord, would we be hope bringers to our culture? We truly believe that you are the answer, that you are the best news, the good news for our culture, including in this topic. And we ask, Lord, would it be, Lord, that people who are experiencing gender dysphoria, any suffering, they think the first place to go is to the church. The first place to go is to Christians. Please would you help us, Lord, to minister something of your love and your goodness in these contexts. We pray, Spirit of God, just be with us as we go from this place, help these things to settle in our hearts and to bless us and help those around us, we ask. Amen.